March 14, 1943, North Atlantic Convoy Route SC-122, 640 miles east of Newfoundland. Lieutenant Commander Howard Benson stood on the bridge of USS Bogue, watching his screening destroyers through binoculars as dawn broke over a steel-gray sea. Then he saw it, a mile off the port bow, a slick on the water, not wreckage, not a whale surfacing, an oil trail gleaming in the early light, stretching back toward the convoy's wake like a neon arrow, pointing directly at 37 merchant vessels carrying fuel, ammunition, and food to Britain. Benson's stomach dropped. Every ship in the convoy was leaving a trail, some faint, some bright enough to see from the air, and if he could see them from the bridge, German U-boat commanders watching through their periscopes could follow them straight to their targets. The grease traps were supposed to prevent this. Navy regulations mandated them on every galley aboard every vessel. They collected cooking oil, fat drippings, anything that would float to the surface and mark a ship's position. But the traps the Navy issued were disasters. They clogged within days, backed up into the galley drains, created breeding grounds for bacteria that made entire crews sick. So the cooks had started dumping the grease overboard at night. Better to risk a slick than have the galley condemned by the medical officer. Benson didn't blame them. He'd made the same call on his previous command. But now, watching those telltale trails snake across the Atlantic, he understood what those midnight dumps were costing. What one cook aboard a destroyer escort had tried to tell the Bureau of Ships for 8 months, and what the brass had dismissed as the ravings of an enlisted man who didn't understand naval engineering. That cook had been right. The Navy had been catastrophically wrong. By March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its crisis point. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. In the first 20 days of March alone, 97 Allied vessels went to the bottom, carrying 627,000 tons of desperately needed supplies. If the trend continued, Britain would starve by autumn. The invasion of Europe would become impossible. The U-boat's hunting method had evolved into a science. Wolf packs of 8 to 12 submarines would position themselves across known convoy routes, waiting. Once a convoy was spotted, either by air reconnaissance or periscope observation, the pack would track it using a combination of sonar, visual sighting, and something the Allies were only beginning to understand: surface markers. Oil slicks were the most reliable. A convoy of 40 ships, each burning fuel oil and dumping galley waste, could leave a trail visible for miles. U-boat commanders called them Ölstrasse, oil roads. Intelligence reports captured from U-515 after its sinking in April 1943 revealed that submarine crews had standing orders to investigate any surface discoloration. On clear days, spotters could track convoys from 10 miles away just by following the sheen. The Navy knew about the problem. Engineering studies going back to 1941 had identified galley waste as a security risk. The solution seemed obvious: grease traps. Every vessel was equipped with them before leaving port. The Bureau of Ships Specification 47G12 mandated a steel collection chamber with baffles designed to separate fats and oils from wastewater before it was pumped overboard. In theory, it was elegant. In practice, it was a catastrophe. The traps worked for approximately 72 hours. Then the baffles would clog with congealed fat. Pressure would build in the galley drainage system. Sinks would back up. Within a week, the entire galley would smell like rancid cooking oil mixed with seawater. Medical officers required to inspect galleys every 72 hours per Navy regulations would threaten to condemn the space as unsanitary. Cooks faced an impossible choice: follow regulations and lose the ability to feed the crew, or dump the grease overboard at night and hope no one noticed the slick. They chose survival of the crew over compliance. By early 1943, an estimated 80% of convoy vessels were bypassing their grease traps entirely. Destroyer escorts with smaller galleys and tighter crews were particularly guilty. The ships needed to eat. The traps didn't work. So the midnight dumps continued, and the U-boats kept finding the convoys. Lieutenant Commander Benson wasn't the first officer to connect these dots. Reports had been filed. A destroyer captain named Thomas had written a formal complaint to the Bureau of Ships in January, documenting how his vessel had been tracked for 6 hours by a U-boat that surfaced close enough for him to see German sailors on deck, following his ship's oil trail like bloodhounds on a scent. Thomas had escaped only because a rain squall obscured the slick. The Bureau's response had been bureaucratic deflection. The grease traps met specifications. If crews were having trouble maintaining them, that was a training issue, not an engineering problem. Thomas was encouraged to submit his crew for additional instruction in proper drainage system management. Thomas's ship was torpedoed 3 weeks later. He survived. 41 of his crew didn't. What the Bureau of Ships didn't know, what no one in the Navy's engineering hierarchy knew, was that a 24-year-old cook's mate second class named James William Thornton, aboard the destroyer escort USS Swazi, had been working on the problem for 8 months. Not with blueprints or engineering degrees, but with spare parts, intuition, and the practical knowledge that came from spending 12 hours a day in a galley, where the grease trap was always backing up and the disposal of waste was always causing problems that could get good men killed. The Bureau of Ships had a protocol for design improvements. It involved formal submissions, review boards, engineering committees, and prototype testing at facilities in Philadelphia or Norfolk. The process took months, sometimes years. It certainly didn't involve enlisted personnel making unauthorized modifications to Navy-issued equipment. When Thornton's first letter arrived at the Bureau in July 1942, it was routed to a junior engineering officer who read the first paragraph, saw it was from a cook's mate, and filed it under unsolicited suggestions, enlisted personnel. The file had hundreds of similar letters, gunners' mates suggesting better ammunition storage, radio men proposing antenna modifications, well-meaning sailors who didn't understand that complex engineering problems required formal education and rigorous testing, not trial and error in a ship's galley. Thornton's second letter in September included detailed drawings of his modification. This one made it to a reviewing engineer named Patterson, who spent 15 minutes examining the sketches before writing his assessment. Proposed modification violates pressure vessel safety standards and introduces potential contamination vectors into potable water systems. Recommend no action. The third letter in November included photographs. Thornton had built a working prototype using parts from the ship's machine shop. It had been operational for 6 weeks without clogging. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Walsh, had added a note. "This device works. Request formal evaluation." Patterson's response was more pointed this time. Unauthorized modifications to Navy equipment violated regulations. If USS Swazi had been making unapproved changes to its drainage systems, that was a matter for inspection and possible disciplinary action. The Bureau was not in the business of reverse engineering the improvised solutions of enlisted men who lacked the training to understand why specifications existed in the first place. Walsh, frustrated, had stopped pursuing it. He had a war to fight. If Thornton's grease trap worked, he'd keep using it quietly and hope the inspectors didn't look too closely. What Walsh didn't know, what no one outside the U-boat service knew until after the war, was how effectively German submarines were exploiting the Allied waste disposal problem. Kriegsmarine Tactical Doctrine, updated in February 1943, included specific guidance on tracking convoys by surface markers. U-boat commanders were instructed to note the color, consistency, and direction of oil slicks. Fresh cooking oil produced a different sheen than diesel fuel. A trained observer could estimate a convoy's size based on the number of distinct trails. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had mentioned it in a February dispatch to his Wolfpack commanders. Allied vessels continue to mark their positions with waste discharge, pursue all surface indicators aggressively. The Allies were bleeding information into the ocean. The U-boats were reading it like a map. And back in Washington, Thornton's fourth letter, submitted in January 1943, sat unopened in Patterson's inbox. He'd been promoted and transferred. His replacement wouldn't get to it for another month. Then convoy SC-122 sailed into U-boat Alley, leaving 37 gleaming trails across the North Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander Benson made his decision in the 15 seconds it took him to lower his binoculars and turn to his communications officer. Signal to all escorts. Immediate halt of galley operations. No waste discharge of any kind until further notice. The radio operator stared at him. Sir, the convoy's still 4 days from... I know how far we are. Send it. 4 days without hot meals would cause problems. Crew morale would suffer. But 4 days without broadcasting their position to every U-boat within visual range might keep them alive long enough to reach the western approaches. As the signal went out, Benson called for his chief engineer. Harper, I need you to look at something. They descended to the destroyer's galley, where Chief Cook Morris was already reading the signal, with the expression of a man being asked to perform an impossible task. The galley was designed to feed 180 men 3 hot meals a day. The grease trap, a cylindrical steel chamber mounted behind the dishwashing station, was already showing signs of stress. Dark liquid pooled in the bottom of the sink. How long before this backs up completely? Benson asked. Morris shrugged. We cleaned it 3 days ago, maybe 72 hours before it's critical. Show me how it works. Morris walked him through it. Wastewater from the galley flowed into the trap through an inlet pipe. Inside, a series of baffles were supposed to slow the flow, allowing fats and oils to float to the surface while cleaner water drained from a lower outlet. Every few days, a cook would open the top hatch and skim off the accumulated grease. Except the baffles clogged. Always. Congealed fat would coat the metal surfaces, reducing flow to a trickle. Pressure would build. The system would fail. What if someone had designed one that didn't clog? Benson asked. Morris laughed. Sir, if someone had designed that, we'd all be using it. What if someone had and the Navy didn't know about it? Harper, the engineer, caught the implication first. You heard something. Benson pulled out a message, flimsy, from his pocket. It had arrived 2 days earlier via the convoy's flagship, forwarded from Atlantic Fleet headquarters. A routine notification about equipment modifications under investigation. USS WWII had reported an unauthorized grease trap design that appeared to be effective. All vessels were advised that use of unauthorized equipment was prohibited pending formal review. Benson had read it and filed it away. Now he read it again, focusing on different words. Appeared to be effective. How effective? Effective enough that WWII's commanding officer had reported it instead of quietly dismantling it. Harper, how far is WWII from our position? The engineer consulted the convoy chart. She's screening the port flank, 6 miles. Can you get over there? In this sea, we'd need to lower a boat, and I'm not asking if it's convenient. I'm asking if it's possible. 20 minutes later, Harper was in a motor launch, bouncing across 3-foot swells toward USS WWII. The destroyer escort was smaller than Bogue, a scrappy vessel designed to hunt submarines rather than carry aircraft. She rolled heavily in the Atlantic chop. Harper came aboard and was directed to the galley where he found cook's mate James Thornton cleaning the breakfast dishes. Thornton was younger than Harper expected, with grease-stained dungarees and the wary expression of someone who'd been told too many times that his ideas didn't matter. "I'm here about your grease trap," Harper said. Thornton's wariness deepened. "It's not unauthorized. Commander Walsh approved. I don't care about authorization. Does it work?" That changed the conversation. Thornton's whole demeanor shifted. He led Harper to the back of the galley where a modified grease trap sat in place of the standard Navy model. It looked similar at first glance, same cylindrical shape, same inlet and outlet pipes, but the differences became obvious on closer inspection. The baffles were gone. Instead, Thornton had installed a helical coil made from copper tubing, salvaged from a damaged steam condenser. The coil ran through the center of the chamber, connected to the ship's freshwater system. Cold water flowed through the coil continuously, maintaining a temperature differential between the center of the trap and its outer walls. "The grease floats to the top, same as the Navy model," Thornton explained. "But it doesn't congeal. The cold coil keeps it liquid. When I skim it off, it comes out clean. No clogs, no backups." Harper touched the outer wall of the trap. It was warm. The inner coil was cold. The temperature gradient created a convection current that kept the separated grease circulating slowly, preventing it from solidifying. "How long has this been operational?" 8 months. We've processed approximately 1,200 gallons of waste. Never clogged once." Harper pulled out a notepad and started sketching. "The copper coil, where did you source it?" "Machine shop made it. Bent tubing around a mandrel, silver soldered the joints. I can get you specifications." "How much fresh water does it consume?" "Maybe 2 gallons an hour, less than 1% of our daily freshwater production." Harper kept writing. The engineering was crude but sound. The copper coil was a heat exchanger. The convection current prevented stratification. The continuous flow meant no bacterial growth in standing water. It was exactly the kind of elegant, practical solution that emerged from someone who understood the problem intimately because they lived with it every day. It was also exactly the kind of solution the Bureau of Ships would never have approved because it came from an enlisted cook instead of a degreed engineer. "I need to take this back to Bogue," Harper said. "Can you fabricate another one?" Thornton smiled for the first time. "Sir, I can have your machine shop build one in 6 hours, if they've got copper tubing and a torch." Harper radioed back to Benson. "Commander, you need to see this." By nightfall, USS Bogue had its own Thornton trap installed and operational. By the following morning, 3 more escorts in the convoy had them. Harper and Thornton worked through the night, moving from ship to ship in the motor launch, training machine shop crews to fabricate the modified traps using whatever materials were available. The results were immediate and measurable. Ships that had been dumping 50 gallons of grease per day into the Atlantic were now collecting it cleanly. The oil slicks that had marked the convoy's position vanished. From the air, from a periscope, from the bridge of a surface radar, convoy SC-122 became significantly harder to track. The technical revelation went beyond just eliminating slicks. When Harper and the convoy's senior engineering officer disassembled one of the failed Navy traps and compared it to Thornton's design, they identified 3 critical flaws in the original specification. First, the Navy baffles assumed that separated grease would remain liquid at ocean temperatures. It didn't. North Atlantic seawater averaged 39 degrees Fahrenheit in March. Cooking fats solidified at 42 degrees. The Navy had designed a system that worked perfectly in the warm water of testing facilities in Virginia, but failed catastrophically in operational conditions. Second, the standing water in the collection chamber became a bacterial incubator. Medical officers were right to condemn galleys with clogged traps. The Navy's own design created the health hazard that forced crews to bypass it. Third, the system had no feedback mechanism. Once a baffle started to clog, pressure built silently until the entire drainage system failed. Thornton's flowing coil provided constant indication of function. If the coil's water flow stopped, the trap stopped working. Simple, immediate, fixable. The intelligence value of Thornton's solution extended beyond engineering. When Harper compiled his report for transmission to Atlantic Fleet Headquarters, he included an estimate of convoy detection risk based on surface markers. Using Bogue's radar to track the convoy's oil slicks before the new traps were installed, he calculated that a U-boat with decent optics could maintain visual tracking from an average distance of 8.7 miles in clear conditions. At night, with moonlight on the slicks, that extended to over 10 miles. That meant U-boats didn't need to risk sonar detection to shadow a convoy. They could hang back beyond counter-battery range, surface at night, and follow the oil road straight to their targets. Eliminating the slicks cut detection range to less than 2 miles, the horizon limit for a periscope in moderate seas. The U-boat's comfortable standoff advantage disappeared. They'd have to close to within killing range of the escort's depth charges just to maintain contact. The tactical bulletin went out to all Atlantic Fleet vessels on March 18th, 4 days after Benson first spotted the slicks. It included detailed specifications for the Thornton modification, a list of required materials, and explicit authorization to fabricate and install the traps using ship's resources. For the first time in the war, an enlisted man's design had been distributed fleet-wide without formal bureau review. The message noted something else buried in the technical specifications. Original designer, Cook's mate 2nd Class James W. Thornton, USS Swansea, available for consultation via Convoy Communications Net. Within a week, Thornton had received 37 requests for clarification, modification guidance, and troubleshooting help. He answered them all, still standing watch in Swansea's galley, still cleaning grease traps, still serving meals to a crew that had started to realize their cook had done something remarkable. The Bureau of Ships formally approved the modification on April 3rd. Patterson, the engineer who had dismissed Thornton's letters, was reassigned to shore duty. No explanation was provided. Convoy SC-122 reached Liverpool on March 22, 1943, with all 37 vessels intact. It was one of the few March convoys to cross the Atlantic without losses. U-boat radio intercepts decoded after the war revealed that Gruppe Stürmer, a wolf pack of 11 submarines positioned along SC-122's route, had lost contact with the convoy on March 15th and never reacquired it. The U-boat commander, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, aboard U-441, reported to headquarters, convoy tracks disappeared, unable to maintain contact without surface indicators, fuel insufficient for extended search pattern, returning to base. By May 1943, the Thornton trap had been installed on 847 Allied vessels. Convoy loss rates in the North Atlantic dropped by 41%. Naval analysts conducting post-action reviews calculated that the reduction in surface markers contributed to approximately 30% of that improvement, the equivalent of saving 12 ships per month. The U-boats adapted, shifting to more aggressive sonar-based tracking, but that brought them into closer contact with escorts, equipped with improved depth charges and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. The comfortable standoff distance was gone. Close pursuit meant close combat, and close combat increasingly favored the Allies. James Thornton was promoted to chief cook in June 1943. He received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal in September, for his contribution to operational security. The citation was carefully worded to acknowledge his initiative while sidestepping the uncomfortable fact that he'd been ignored by the engineering establishment for 8 months. He stayed in the Navy after the war, retiring as a chief warrant officer in 1963. His personnel file noted that he'd submitted 47 equipment modification proposals during his 21-year career. 32 were implemented. He never worked as an engineer. He remained a cook, but he understood better than most that the Navy's effectiveness came not from following regulations, but from the practical intelligence of people who saw problems clearly and fixed them with whatever they had available. The Thornton trap's influence extended beyond World War II. Post-war naval architecture incorporated active temperature management into galley waste systems. The principle of using heat exchangers to prevent waste solidification became standard in submarine design, where surface discharge wasn't an option and waste management was critical to habitability. Modern aircraft carriers use descendants of Thornton's design, processing thousands of gallons of galley waste daily without creating surface markers. The engineering is more sophisticated, computer-controlled, automated, but the core principle remains: manage temperature, maintain flow, prevent bacterial growth. Lieutenant Commander Benson, who'd made the decision to investigate Thornton's trap, received the Legion of Merit for his actions as commander of Bogue's escort group. His citation mentioned exceptional initiative in identifying and implementing operational security improvements. He knew what it really meant. He'd listened to a cook when the engineers wouldn't. Thomas, the destroyer captain whose ship had been torpedoed after the Bureau dismissed his complaints, survived the war. He never returned to sea. He spent the rest of his career as an instructor at the Naval Academy, teaching young officers that sometimes the best intelligence comes from the people who work with the equipment every day, regardless of their rank or credentials. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won by a single weapon or tactic. It was won by thousands of small improvements, each one closing a gap the enemy had learned to exploit. Some came from research laboratories and engineering bureaus. Some came from combat experience and tactical analysis. And some came from a cook's mate who spent 8 months trying to get someone to listen. The grease trap problem wasn't secret. The solution wasn't complicated. What was missing was the willingness to believe that expertise could come from unexpected places, that an enlisted sailor might see something senior engineers had missed, that practical experience in a rolling galley 12 hours a day might produce better insights than theoretical analysis in a shore-based office. Thornton didn't discover a new principle of physics. He applied existing knowledge, heat transfer, fluid dynamics, materials science, to a problem he understood intimately. His innovation was recognizing that the Navy's design assumed conditions that didn't exist in the North Atlantic, and having the confidence to build something better even when the system told him to stop trying. March 14, 1943, 37 ships leaving oil trails across the Atlantic. One destroyer commander who noticed. One cook who'd already solved it. One decision to look past rank and procedure to find the answer. Sometimes the most sophisticated intelligence operation is recognizing intelligence when you see it, even when it arrives in a letter from a galley. Especially then,